All right. Good morning. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar. As you know, my name is Carmen Boone. I'm an education coordinator from Oregon Pacific Area Health Education Center, a hosted agency of Samaritan Lebanon Community Hospital. Our agency mission is to promote access to quality healthcare through community and educational partnerships. Today, I will be your host and moderator. Let's go over some housekeeping items. Please mute your microphones and unmute them to answer questions. Please use the Q&A and at the bottom to ask questions at any time, and the chat for comments or answers. We will be monitoring both throughout the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. If you have any questions, please send me an email at the address that you see on your screens right now. To obtain credit or contact hours or certificate of attendance for this activity, you must log into www.eeds.com and enter this activity code. Please write down the activity code for your records and consider that it expires within 1 week. We will email you these instructions and the link today within a couple of hours after the webinar. This presentation is jointly provided by Samaritan Health Services, Oregon Pacific AHEC, Oregon AHEC, and the Oregon Health and Science University. The presenters and planners of this activity report that we don't have conflicts of interest or relevant financial relationships with any commercial entities that might affect the contents of this presentation. This webinar is presented by Drs. Tina Runyan and John Fleischman. They are both clinical psychologists with backgrounds in academic medicine and integrated behavioral health. Throughout their work as directors of behavioral health programs in family medicine residencies, they identified a need for better mental health and well-being support for clinicians. In 2020, they founded 10 Health to focus on providing specialized and accessible mental health care to healthcare professionals. 10 Health offers mental health care in 9 states, including Oregon and Washington. They are passionate about clinician well-being and consult with healthcare organizations to improve well-being and reduce barriers to care. Now I leave you with Drs. Tina and Joan.
Thank you so much, Carmen. Good morning to everybody. Wherever you come from, maybe good afternoon to a few of you, and just welcome to our mindful communication and difficult conversations topic today. We've been doing these for several months now with kind of more of a didactic presentation followed by a practice lab. So today we're really focusing on how to bring mindfulness into our communication and how to manage difficult conversations. So I'm Joan Fleischman. I'm a clinical psychologist and co-founder of Tend Health. And next slide. Can you advance? There we go. Yeah. And so this is actually our last presentation before we go into our last practice lab at the end of or mid-June. And so this is really kind of the culmination of all of the topics that we have touched on and kind of bringing this into how we interact with our fellow, mostly humans, maybe some furry friends in communicating. Next slide. So we, our only disclosure is that Tend Health provides mental health and well-being services to healthcare professionals and healthcare organizations. And we're not here to promote anything today around our business. So these are our learning objectives. We're really going to talk about why we shy away from conflict, or for some of us, it feels like a very comfortable place and we lean in. I think how to reframe conflict as a way of looking inward and understanding what is happening in the interaction, and how we can look at it as a manifestation of unmet needs, and how to regulate internally in difficult conversations, which I think is a practice. It takes practice, and it's something we're always working on. And then just really the idea of how you actually apply some of the principles of mindfulness and nonviolent communication to these conversations. So I want you just to think about how much of your day working in the healthcare field you spend in communication with others, whether it's direct face-to-face conversations, whether it's over Zoom or video chat, whether it's on the phone, texting, or through email. We spend most of our day communicating with others. And so what I want you to do, we're going to just do a thought experiment here. I want you to think back to the very last communication you had, probably this morning. Maybe it was last night, maybe it was yesterday, but what was the last time that you had communication with someone? Maybe it was a text message, maybe it was interaction in the kitchen, making breakfast this morning. Maybe it's right now, you're writing an email, but what was that last communication? And I want you just to take a moment. If you're writing that email, maybe pause for a second, close your eyes. And I want you to turn inward. And I want you to remember that moment of communication, that interaction, and ask yourself, how was I feeling? What was going on in my body, in my mind, and in my heart? Maybe there was some frustration. Maybe you were full of love. What was happening for you? And then I want you to turn your attention to what was going on in your external environment in that moment. Was it busy? Was it loud? Were you outside? Were the birds chirping? Was there extraneous noise pollution going on? Leaf blowers or hair dryers? Were there lots of things going on? Was it calm? Was your attention being asked for by something else or someone else in that moment? And now I want you to turn your mind towards that other person or group of people that you might have been communicating with. Can you step into what they might have been experiencing in that moment? What might have been going on for them? And can you imagine what their environment, their physical external environment was like? So if you've closed your eyes, go ahead and open them. and feel free to chat in. You should all be made panelists at this point. And Carmen, if there's a few people who just joined, maybe we can make them panelists. And just, I'm curious about what was the experience for you? Particularly, I want to highlight that for many of us, well, I would say we don't know what the other person is feeling, thinking. We don't know what their internal experience is. And we don't know, we may not even know what their environment is like. If they're in another physical environment, we may not know what's going on around them. Especially with people's virtual Zoom backgrounds, right? you know, they put up a nice beach in the background. You have no idea if there's like kids running back there, or like they're sitting in their garage or their barn, or like really what's going on. You know, I think there's a lot that we don't know. So what do we know? We can really tune into what's going on for us in that moment. We can really be aware of what's going on in our physical environment and how that may interact with what's going on for us. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that as we go into this conversation today, because we are in communication most of our day. And what is going on for us and what is going on in our environment is very relevant. And what is going on for the other person is also very relevant, but we don't know that. We can make it up, we can try to figure it out, but unless we ask, we don't know. So next slide. So I think that one of the things that I want to just highlight again is this idea that what we all have different lenses that we interpret words and nonverbal communication. And so when you're a receiver of communication or information, you will interpret it with your own experience and your own lens. And so what one person says may be interpreted very differently. Oh, great. So this is exactly what this slide is trying to illustrate, is that what you're trying to say, or someone speaking to you, may not be exactly what they hear. And I think one of the things that we can work on, and we'll talk a little bit about some techniques for today, is how do you actually close this loop? How do you bring your understanding into the conversation? So what I heard you saying is, so I just want to get clear where we landed with this. Okay, I hear that next steps are and closing that loop so you can make sure you're on the same page. We don't do this very often. I think especially when there's a time crunch, we're just like, okay, got it, right, and move on. But what you got may have been very different than what the person who was trying to tell you something was trying to tell you. Do you want to say more about that, Tina?
I'm just, smiling to myself of just recalling my own sort of miscommunication this morning in that vein, and how useful that exercise was to just name and acknowledge that I don't know actually what the other person's experience is, and how much my own internal experience will shape maybe not as much what I'm saying, but how I'm saying it. And to have that dual awareness, essentially, that is true for the other person too, and how myopic, how easy it is to get really focused on your own experience and not broaden in that way. So
it just, especially when there's a time crunch, it's just, I think when you're sitting on the couch on a Saturday morning and you have all the time in the world, maybe there is more, we lean into that. But I think on these little day-to-day interactions, that's really challenging.
Yeah. So I'll pick it up from here and really talk about some strategies, I think, for completing this loop that we're talking about here. And we can simultaneously kind of look at the chat. So if people are having some even initial comments, reflections, it doesn't even have to be a question. We really welcome your engagement in the chat to try to concretize these concepts in a very tangible way to your experiences. So please use the chat liberally as we move forward. So the title of this talk was around mindful communication and basically using mindfulness, which if you've been to some of our previous presentations, we've done a deep dive into what is mindfulness, what mindfulness isn't, and how to bring it to your daily practice, not so much as a sit on your cushion and do a mindful meditation, 45 to 60 minutes a day, but how do you actually just bring the present moment awareness with some compassion to your day-to-day work. So that's what we're going to be weaving into this conversation around communication, is that Joan's just highlighted that communication has this expressive element and it has this receptive element, sort of what we are saying and what we are hearing in this dyad. And sometimes that's synchronous, if in a video or phone or in-person conversation, and sometimes it's asynchronous in an email or in a text conversation. But those elements are there, whether it's real time synchronous or whether there's some delay in that. There is both an expressive and a receptive element in our communication, and both actually are equally important. If I was going to weight in one, I would weight on the receptive element. If I were to say kind of which part is comparatively more important, I don't know who said something like, when you're speaking, you're just saying what you already know. So when you're listening, you have this opportunity to hear something you don't already know. And what does mindfulness have to do with it? Well, mindfulness really is, in Joan's exercise this morning, is really trying to take the internal temperature, in a sense, of bringing this element of awareness, both to our expressive element and to our receptive element, and then actually carrying it a step further, as she did in that example, into this larger context. So bringing awareness actually into the larger context. And to be mindful in communication is to be able to, present moment, real time, have a sense of how our own internal environment actually is showing up, both in what we say, in how we say it, and in how we perceive what is being said. So it may not be that we can change the tint on our glasses in the moment if we're in a really low mood, for example, or if we're feeling very pressured and stressed. We may not be able to change the tint that has a little gray or maybe a little rose, that frame rose colored glasses. Mindfulness is just about bringing awareness. Oh, this is not clear seeing in this moment. There is a tint here. And just having that present moment awareness that there's a tint can be really skillful. I'm just going to note what Rita is sharing. I thought I knew what somebody was talking about. I stopped and listened instead of interrupting, and it helped with the communication to wait for more information. So that really is displaying a level of mindfulness, of pausing. And that's so resonant with a patient interaction I had just before this presentation this morning, and talking about the power of the pause in communication. And it doesn't have to be a long pause, but when we can recognize even that impulse to interrupt or to with making assumptions, and we can pause, that has everything to do with mindfulness, of present moment awareness, that a pause might serve us at this time. So just a quick reminder around that mindfulness really about being this wedge of awareness. So information coming in, either you're reading it or you're listening to it or you're interpreting it from nonverbals. And mindfulness is just becoming aware of our own internal landscape, of how our biases may be showing up, our judgments, our assumptions may be showing up, so that we can move towards a more authentic and a more skillful response. So that's really what we're talking about when we talk about mindful communication. It's bringing awareness to how we communicate and to our own internal experience during communication. And then perhaps even this awareness that whoever else we're in communication with, another person, a group of people, simultaneously have their own internal experiences that are likely showing up in their communication, and maybe showing up in a sense of being unaware, depending on whether they're able to bring this quality of mindfulness to their communication. So the principles of mindfulness towards the application of communication have these elements of setting an intention, right? An intention to pause, an intention to be open and listen with that mindful awareness. To bring your full presence to the conversation. How often do we try anyway to multitask as we're communicating? How often are we simultaneously, right, trying to listen to somebody and answer an email or attend to something else? And we trick ourselves into thinking that our brain actually has that capacity. What we're doing is very quick, sort of serial attention, and rapid shifting back and forth, because we can't actually simultaneously like be in the both receptive mode and the expressive mode. And oftentimes we're doing that, right, in two different in two different conversations, or at least two different conversations with different people. And so bringing your full presence. So if you are if you're in a conversation, like, that really is where your mind is, where your heart is, and what you being embodied in that conversation. Remaining open and non-judgmental, those are these components of mindfulness as we apply it to our own experience and as we apply it to communication, is remaining in a stance of not closing off too soon with our assumptions or our own needs, and trying as best we can to stay in that non-judgmental state, and relating to others with compassion, relating to ourselves with compassion. So those are kind of the elements around what we mean by mindful communication. And I certainly welcome any questions or suggestions for clarification in the chat as well. So what are the roadblocks to mindful listening? What are the things that draw us out of the present moment, where we can't be fully in that receptive mode without judging, without premature closure and understanding what people are, or trying to understand what people are saying? So there's a couple of elements, and you may, again, reflecting on from that exercise that Joan led us through, you might see elements of one or more of these from your communication with somebody even today. So one is our comparing mind, this tendency that is quite automatic for most of us, where we very quickly will step into comparison. And we might be comparing somebody's experience to our experience. We often will compare somebody's reaction to their experience to what we presume our reaction would be or has been. So the comparing mind is very strong, even in this receptive stance. And it may not be anything that actually gets expressed, but mindful communication has this quality of just noticing what's happening in the internal landscape, noticing what's coming up for you. So comparing mind. Mind reading has to do with sort of getting ahead, right? What is the person going to say next? I know where this is going. Mind reading is, the more intimate a relationship is, the more likely or common it will be for mind reading to happen. Perhaps because you could be like, I could write this script. We've had this same conversation however many times. And that cuts us off from being really in a mindful listening or receptive mode, because we're already predicting what this person is going to say or how this person is going to say it. And that, again, that is something that we can just notice as it comes up for us. rehearsing. So hearing a little bit of what's coming to you, and whatever that first component is, already starting your response. As soon as we start planning our response after listening, while listening to somebody, there is some degradation in what we can listen to. All of that is the multitasking. So even if you're not writing an email to somebody else, if you are in your mind planning what you are going to say, you've already taken some percentage of attention. It's somewhere less than 100%, which is hard to do anyway. Somewhat less than that as soon as you started rehearsing. That idea of, are you listening or are you just planning what you're going to say? As soon as we start rehearsing, we're no longer really in that mindful listening mode. And then,
Can I say something about that?
Please.
So I think that some of these come up when we start to feel anxious.
Yeah.
And so I just want to normalize these four kind of roadblocks, if you will, and also say that some of this comes up when we start to feel anxious, or we start to feel threatened, or we feel like there's something that's feeling a little off. We start to try to read someone's mind. We start to rehearse what we're going to say in defense, or kind of to have a plan. So I just want to kind of normalize that and say that often we will drop into one of these when we're starting to feel that.
Yes. Yeah. These can actually occur in the absence of communication. If you've ever had, a silent meal or you've had that sort of silent car ride, right, where there's been a little bit of conflict and there isn't active communication happening in terms of neither is really listening or talking, but there's a lot of internal communication that's happening. So these can happen. We don't need a lot of external stimuli to actually even create a lot of these things. And they're much more likely to be amplified, yes, when we have some anxiety around the communication, that there's potential conflict, or we feel destabilized in some way, particularly in a power dynamic communication. These can be really present. And so the judging mind is this other one. And so I really appreciate that comment to normalize this. This is what our mind does. And mindfulness is not about, if I can be mindful, these things will never happen to me anymore. In the same way that our ears are going to pick up sounds that are in our ambient environment, our eyes are going to see what's around us. Our minds are going to do these things because our minds are always working on, it's sort of the original AI, if you will, not artificial, but sort of the I part of AI, and doing a lot of predictive analytics. And there's heuristics that are happening in our mind that have been going on since you were born, to try to make sense of the world around you and to try to keep you alive and to try to keep you safe. And this is just what our minds do. So mindfulness isn't like, oh, if I can be mindful, then all these things go away. Actually, in fact, when you're mindful, you just can become much more aware that these things are happening. But the magic in that awareness is that we are not tugged around by reacting to things coming at us and things coming up from us. When we're not mindful, when we're not aware, we're constantly in these reactivity patterns in our communication that we don't really have a chance to mitigate. And so mindfulness is not about, oh, if I have this awareness, then my mind doesn't do these things anymore. No, your mind's still going to do them. It's just that you can start to be aware. So I have a little exercise that I'd like to walk us through, and we'll use the chat for this. And what I want you to do is listen to these lines, but pay attention to what's happening in your mind. Pay attention to what comes up in your mind during this little story. And then I would love for people to sort of to chat in. So here's the story. John was on his way to school today. He was worried about the math class. He was not sure he could control the class again today. It was not part of the janitor's duty. So I'd love for someone to chat in. What did you notice in your mind, if anything? What did you notice that your mind was doing when it heard that very little story? And Joan, maybe you can, while people are chatting, you could share if you noticed anything in your mind.
Well, first I thought John was a student. and then I thought John was a teacher. But then you just switched it all up when I learned that John was neither a student nor a teacher. Yeah, Sydney, I was like, oh yeah, worried about math class, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So Cindy, John was a student, and maybe somebody even had a sense of like, oh yeah, like, sort of comparing, like, oh, I didn't like math class either, or like, what? He's worried about math class. Math is the best. Some kind of comparing. That as you listen to that, your mind tried to make sense of the data points. Your mind tried to make sense of that information. And I use that little example to absolutely normalize that our minds are always going to do this. Our minds are always trying to find the line of best fit between the data points. So to know that is what our minds will do, and our minds are particularly prone to these kinds of comparing, mind reading, rehearsing, and to have some allowance for that, to have some compassion for ourselves in that. Thank you, Leah. Lovely. Yeah, you actually felt when he was worried, you felt that sense of compassion come up for him. Yeah. So this is what this is the nature of our source code, of who we are. This is the hardware and software that we all kind of came with, and we've been using for a long time. And there's lots of ways in which it serves us well. So our minds are going to do this. The mindfulness piece is just to increase your present moment awareness that that's happening, and to not be tugged around by it in terms of reactivity. So the way that I could frame this is, in terms of mindful communication, is as best you can to place this empty cup of attention between you and kind of insert, you and a patient, you and a partner, you and a child, you and a friend. So if you can bring your whole presence, and you can have that awareness of both what's happening inside you and external, and notice it, moment to moment. You notice the mind reading come up, and then you come back into just pure presence, kind of in pure listening, without reacting to what you think is going to be said, but you stay with what is actually being said. So that's the invitation around mindful communication. And I welcome any comments or questions about that before we sort of transition a little bit into talking about conflict.
Well, I was just thinking so if you're trying to be mindful, then are you taking the attention away from the communication and the interaction? If you're like, okay, what am I feeling? Like, what's going on? So I think there's a balance.
Yeah.
Of that.
Yeah, I often think about kind of so there's this cup of attention, right? That sphere kind of includes all of it? Like, can you sort of broaden and include all of it? That it's what's happening for this person, what's being put into this space, and kind of what you are sort of putting into this space yourself simultaneously. Yeah. And really it's about dialing down the reactivity so that as we cultivate that sense of presence, and as we cultivate a sense of mindfulness in communication, we are just much less likely to cut somebody off, to make assumptions, to react from what's coming up for us that we may not even be aware of what's coming up, or to react to the content of something, or react to the tone of something, ignoring the content. That to be able to integrate all of those, it's why listening, like really generous mindful listening, is a pretty high metabolic demand. There's actually a fair amount of, if you think like, I mean, even in the work that we do, Joan and I, that, oh, well, I'm just sitting and listening to people all day. why am I tired at the end of the day, right? It's actually a pretty high metabolic demand to be mindfully, generously listening to somebody. So how do we bring this into the realm of conflict? And so conflict, like Joan was saying, is that our frame around conflict can be so important. And often conflict can really be, has the opportunity anyway to be a birthplace for more intimacy, if we can meet it skillfully. So what our pattern is in meeting conflict, I think can be really important to be explicit about. And it's not that we all are sort of one way all the time, but because we're humans, we tend to be patterned in particular ways around habitual ways of meeting conflict. And so here are 4 kind of frames of how a lot of us will deal with conflict. The first is to be really conflict avoidant. And this is somebody that, knows that there's something that needs to be talked about, but just kicks the can down the road continually. Just the underlying need there is often one of sort of connection and harmony. So the need or the value of harmony sort of trumps that approaching conflict. And so there's conflict avoidance. And so you could see this in your professional lives, or kind of in your personal lives, where there's really something that needs to be addressed, but you think that in doing so, somebody is going to get defensive or reactive, or you're going to have to provide feedback to somebody that isn't pleasant. And so we just find all sorts of creative ways to not do that and not address the elephant in the room. That's conflict avoidance. Competitive confrontation has a very different, it's almost the other end of the continuum, which is a tendency to really get out in front of things, to be assertive, if not really aggressive, in trying to get one's needs met, or making sure that there's no opportunity for these things to fester. And so to really be almost not creating conflict necessarily, but not shying away from it at all. So that's the confrontation approach. And oftentimes the need underlying that is really one of autonomy, and sometimes even safety. Sometimes you can actually see people, and we've talked about this even in some of our previous presentations, around why might somebody present in a way that is a little bit aggressive in a healthcare space. That confrontation, actually underlying that, could be a real need for safety. But stylistically, that's a very different approach than being conflict avoidant. Passivity is different than conflict avoidance in that the underlying kind of it's not that you're avoiding the conflict, it's that there's an assumption or a presumption, if you will, that the conflict exists because there's something wrong with you, that there's it will just be better if I do it or if I don't say anything. The idea that conflict, that somehow there's something about you or your approach to this that might be creating the potential for conflict. So you'll just sort of absorb all of that. And the need underlying that is often one around acceptance and kind of affirmation and acceptance. And so it's less about, I don't want to point this out because they're going to get upset. More like, I must be doing something wrong here. That's more of the stance of passivity. And then passive aggression is not, I'm doing something wrong, and it's not specifically avoidant. It's it's doing things that are not directly approaching the conflict, but making it quite known in other ways. So sarcasm in speech can be a very passive aggressive way to be in speech or in to address conflict, or just casually if you're cleaning up the kitchen and you do all the dishes except for one particular person's dishes in in the house, is sort of a passive aggressive way to approach that. And sometimes the need underlying that is really a need to have your needs acknowledged and to matter, to feel like you are seen. That can sometimes be the need underlying that way of meeting conflict. And again, we don't, sometimes it may depend on the person. It may depend on the kind of relationship. We might have one approach in work and a different approach in our personal lives. But if people are willing, I'm going to encourage you, if you're willing to say in the chat, if you have any questions about that, or if you're willing to say in the chat, listening to those, I have a sense of my pattern of meeting conflict. Would anyone be so courageous as to reflect on that and name it? And if you don't do it in the chat, that's fine. I just encourage you to do it even silently to yourself, because it can be really helpful. This isn't a judgment about one particular style of conflict being better than the other. It's about knowing what the tendency is, which often comes from modeling too. Kind of, how did you learn how to meet or not meet conflict? And sometimes it can become from modeling of doing what was modeled. And sometimes it can be, this is what was modeled to me, and so I'm actually going to do something quite different because that didn't feel good in what I was exposed to.
I keep thinking about communication and having the way that we communicate can be really framed in our culture, and thinking about different cultural norms around communication and thinking about different cultural norms around conflict, and how that our culture can very much influence both the culture of just our immediate family, the people we grew up with, like you talked about, kind of modeling, but also our larger culture, and how we address conflict and how we communicate. And for one way of communicating in one culture may be very socially acceptable and could be just very inappropriate in another culture. So I think I just wanted to call that out and invite folks to think about how the culture they grew up in may be influencing how they meet conflict, or even how they communicate in general. And that I think that's part of our work as we come into a workplace, as we work with patients who are from different cultures and colleagues who are from different cultures, is to learn more about what is a comfortable way for them to communicate. And then also, can you put their communication style or their conflict style in the context of their culture? So really important note there.
It's a beautiful way to bring mindfulness and to stay kind of in non-judgmental awareness, right? You're using language that's sort of just like descriptive and sort of naming rather than making assumptions about. Yeah. And we often will lean in towards cultures around conflict style that fit, right? It can be very uncomfortable to be in a particular culture that has one style of addressing conflict if your style is very different.
And the whole idea of like, I'm thinking of, not wanting, growing up in a family where you don't talk about things because you don't want to rock the boat, right? You don't like that just avoidance of like anything that will not keep everything in status quo and homeostasis. And then maybe meeting a partner who had more of a competitive confrontation kind of style, and how that can feel so intrusive and like, oh no, we don't do that. So it's just, I think also through life we can, I certainly think that when I at a younger me was much more passive aggressive in the way I met conflict, and really have shifted from that to probably more passive and conflict avoidant. And maybe I'll end up in somewhere else. But I think that you can shift over time as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I appreciate the couple of people chatting in just to reflect that a lot of modeling in families and how we kind of adopt the same thing. And then we're in a very different space too, like with social media. I mean, I think number two is so prevalent in social media of competitive confrontation, because you have these layers of maybe not even anonymity, but there's enough distance that you see a lot of confrontation in a fairly, I think, unskilled way in those spaces. So so knowing how we meet conflict can be really important. And then if we can frame it again as a possibility for deepening intimacy, and if we can consider that conflict can often occur at the level of our strategies, if you will, that it's kind of what we want. And if we can identify what we need and why we want what we want, then there can be less conflict. So this invitation is, again, from a mindful perspective, to really deepen into what am I feeling and what needs are being unmet. So if there is a need for harmony and you're feeling this tension, the strategy that you're using is to avoid conflict, but it doesn't actually resolve anything. And so being able to be really clear about the strategy that one is using, and this definitely can happen in passive aggressive dyads or workplaces. The strategy is actually not moving you any closer to getting those needs met. Whereas when you can be really clear about what you're feeling and what unmet needs are there, it can move you to a place where you are much more well positioned to have healthier conflict resolution with deepening trust and deepening intimacy in that relationship. It does start from a place of being really grounded in your own body. So to Joan's point of like earlier of like the proliferation of all the things in the mind map to all the activation in the body as well. And so those can be quite synergistic. So when we start to get anxious in our body, the mind goes even more, and vice versa. So starting from a place of pause and regulating yourself first can actually be a step into, like you really are stepping into a way of meeting some conflict that has a much higher likelihood of resolving in a way, again, that deepens trust and deepens intimacy. And that grounding in your own body, that pause doesn't have to be, again, a long practice. It can just be really slowing down. You can slow down the pace of your speech, and that can invite a different energy into a conversation. You can just do some kind of intentional focus on something grounding in your own body, touch points. If you're standing, feet on the floor. If you're sitting, sort of seat in the chair. You could focus just on like your center line. So how, really grounding by getting really aligned in your own body. An alignment of the body can invite an alignment of speech, can invite an alignment, being aligned in your body, to be aligned in your values. So these don't have to be really sophisticated ways of moving into this space from your own internal regulation. And then if it's a potential for a lot of activation, doing some rehearsal yourself on your side, not a rehearsal about what is the other person going to say, but a rehearsal on your side if you have to offer some feedback that might be potentially contentious, or you need to bring something up in a relationship because there is clear conflict that's being avoided or not being addressed, or being addressed in a potentially harmful way through some passive aggressive strategies. You can rehearse that. So you rehearse what you're feeling, you're rehearsing what your needs are, you're rehearsing what you're observing, and to try to do that in a way that doesn't then come out scripted, but isn't the first time you're actually putting words to it. That can be a very useful strategy to move into a space of conflict that might, or that potential conflict that might be difficult for you. And then at any point in the conversation, and I love this, is like, you say, I feel like we're not hearing one another, we're not communicating effectively. Can we start over? Right? You just ask for a do-over in the conversation. Can we start over? And if somebody has the same intention to effectively communicate, almost always that answer will be yes. And if the answer is no, it's probably a cue that maybe this conversation is over. Maybe we need to address this at a different time if the answer is no. So those are some specific concrete tools for regulating yourself, and we'll go through these more in the practice lab. So when I talk about thinking about conflict really as this opportunity, and thinking about how to regulate yourself and bring mindfulness of it, a very, I think, rich companion to this way of communication, and particularly in terms of conflict, are these components of nonviolent communication. And so there's four components of nonviolent communication, and this is kind of a whole deeper training in and of itself. But the first is that we start with observations, and we start with very concrete actions that we observe, not the interpretation or not the impact of what we observe, but just the observations, right? And these would be things that, objectively anybody else could see. Now, they may be things that you have strong feelings about and are really affecting you, which is a different component. That's now talking about the feelings. But often we start to fuse these together when we're talking with somebody, or we're going to talk about something that has a lot of conflict. They sort of get lumped together. So really beginning to separate those. So here's the observation. Here's the feeling that is there, not the thoughts, not why I think you're doing this or what this means, but just the actual feeling. What are some needs for yourself in that moment, identifying your own needs that may be unmet. And then if there's a specific ask for what one would like instead. So just use maybe a common, but probably a comparatively benign example. If you're living in household with somebody who tends to leave dishes in the sink, or doesn't do the dishes, and that's a place of conflict. The observation is, I've noticed for the last 3 nights, when I go into the kitchen at the end of the night, your dishes are in the sink. That's just an observation, right? That's not anything about, you're leaving those dishes for me, you're inconsiderate, any of those things. It's just the observation. There are dishes in the sink. I feel, however it is that what that feeling is. So not the interpretation, but just what the feeling is. So I feel anxious when there are undone dishes in the sink, and that my need is to start my morning with the sink clear. My need is that to go into the kitchen in the morning when it's clear. And my choices are, I can either do your dishes. My ask is really that you find a way to be able to do those, so that when I start my morning, I get up before you. When I start my morning, I go into a clean kitchen. That's sort of an example of that rubric, if you will. So we'll do more about that in the practice lab. And it really starts with that observation. To be able to observe without evaluation is the highest form of human intelligence. And I encourage you to practice with this, even just this next couple of weeks. It's extremely hard. Once you start doing it, you see how fused we get with interpretation. So just in summary, in terms of mindful communication, lead with presence. It will never let you down. Stick close to your intention to be mindful, to be fully present and receptive, as well as expressive, to offer some curiosity and some compassion, and to do that with both what you say, but probably most importantly, how you say it. So with that, we'll come to the end of our slides and presentation. And I appreciate everybody's listening and engagement, and we'll turn it over to Carmen to wrap us up.
Thank you. So thank you everybody for participating today. Some items to keep in mind. Please claim your certificate to be able to complete the program evaluation. It'll take just a couple of minutes, and it will be of great help to us. The activity code expires in 1 week. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. Feel free to reach out to me or our office if you have any questions or concerns. We'll be happy to be of assistance. And after the webinar, in about a couple of hours, we'll be emailing you the instructions on how to get your certificates and the links to our channel. Also, we have one more session left in a couple of weeks on June 17. So you're welcome to attend it, and keep your eyes open to upcoming events from our organization. We'll be sending a couple of emails soon. Again, the activity code is 97 GILD. Please write it down. And thank you so much for sharing your time with us. Thank you for the speakers for being here today. And thank you, everybody. You've now completed the session, and you may disconnect. Goodbye. Have a great morning, everybody.
Be well, everyone.
Thank you. See you soon.
Bye.